Thanks for having us here today. And apologies if I start losing my voice. My daughter's cold has just hit me as I was driving up to the Blue Mountains this morning. So we are talking about 2019 New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry. And apologies for our interstate counterparts. It is very New South Wales focused. So the inquiry made 76 recommendations, including the planning specific recommendation 27. The response to recommendation 27 is jointly being led by the Department of Planning and Environment and the Rural Fire Service. Recommendation 27 states that the government commit to a shifting to a strategic planning approach, develop a New South Wales bushfire policy in order to accommodate changing climate conditions and building on greater resilience into communities. The 2019-20 New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry noted that the current planning approach generally focuses on site-based decisions and that there is a need to move to a risk-based strategic planning approach to planning for bushfires. And also to keep tucked into the back of your heads for a little bit later, the inquiry's recommendation also aligns with the New South Wales Flood Inquiry's findings in relation to moving to a risk-based approach to addressing natural hazards. So, the main requirements of recommendation 27 are to develop a New South Wales bushfire policy, consideration of climate change, better bushfire mapping, integration of risk into strategic planning, and building resilience into existing future communities. Back in 2021, DPE and the RFS delivered a collective position paper to the State Emergency Management Committee. The roadmap forming part of the position paper established the recommendation be delivered over 3 phases. So phase 1, Explore, involved identifying the key inputs and considerations to form a New South Wales bushfire policy, and that phase is now complete. Phase 2, which is what we're heading into, is Prepare. So this relates to the preparation of the full New South Wales bushfire policy and the bushfire prone land package. Phase 3 is Deliver, which is the final refinement of the package and government endorsements. Noting we have 2 ministers to go through. So, phase 1, Explore. This was a collaborative effort between 2 government agencies that may not necessarily see eye to eye. We worked collaboratively towards a common goal by jointly unpacking and delivering phase 1 of the recommendation and to work towards considering bushfire risk-based approach for land use planning. Phase 1 consisted of research, engagement and consultation. The main phase 1 research topics included the planning framework, climate change, resilience, hazard versus risk and biodiversity. There were other topics, but these were the main ones. For the planning framework, we reviewed the environmental planning instruments and DCPs of all 120 councils located on bushfire-prone land. And to our absolute surprise and amazement, there was absolutely no consistency between any of those councils. Some DCPs were still referring to the 2006 Planning for Bushfire Protection. We identified that the planning system is heavily reliant on site-based development controls, with Chapter 4, the Strategic Planning chapter, referring to site-based considerations or bushfire protection measures of Chapters 5 to 8 of PBP. There are limited provisions within the EP&A Act and planning instruments to prohibit development in areas where bushfire risks are too great and cannot be mitigated. There is limited guidance on how to consider managing bushfire risk strategically. For hazard versus risk, there was general confusion between what a hazard is and what a risk is. Our findings also show that the consideration of hazard alone does not create an accurate picture of how bushfire may impact on existing and future communities. And while the concept of undertaking risk assessment isn't new, there are many risk-based frameworks and the assessment methods that exist. None are specific for land use planning and are really difficult to apply. For climate change, as we know, climate change is impacting the likelihood and length and therefore the severity of bushfire season. Climate change projections predict that severe fire weather will increase and fires will be harder to control. Therefore, it is important to consider and integrate climate change scenarios into the bushfire planning for future land use planning. Also, to note that there will be a parliamentary inquiry into climate change and the planning system, so watch this space. The RFS will lead the implementation of climate change adaptation for the bushfire risk management plans, and together with the Department of Planning and Environment, will work towards adaptation and implementation for land use planning. For resilience, to build resilience into existing future communities, natural hazards need to be considered upfront in the planning process and not pushed down to the DA or development application. The question we really should be asking in strategic land use planning is, can changes to land use planning support an increased density of population? And can we get people safely in or out, evacuate? And can the infrastructure support the evacuation? And this is an important consideration for resilient communities. For biodiversity, this one was very topical. Every stakeholder we talked to, biodiversity was a key issue. Bushfire and biodiversity are intrinsically linked. There are opportunities to improve decision-making around biodiversity, land clearing, offsetting, urban tree cover, and urban heat. So, engagement consultation. The team engaged extensively with local councils, a number of government agencies, industry groups, developers, bushfire associations, bushfire practitioners, academics, and the Insurance Council of Australia. Engagement occurred through a mix of working groups, workshops, and meetings. We established 3 working groups with agencies, local council, and industry representation. So, stakeholder feedback, what we heard. So for land use and development, strategic planning was described as that missing middle for bushfire. Developers particularly wanted certainty up front at the strategic planning stage to support housing and growth decisions based on an understanding of tolerable risk. And there was a need for a better consideration of existing community and infrastructure to inform if and how an area may be able to accommodate increased density of population due to extreme fire weather behaviour and under climate change. Resourcing and education. The majority of councils identified resourcing constraints. Resourcing difficulties were apparent for rural areas, and councils identified that it was even difficult getting bushfire consultants in these regional areas. Council and the department noted lack of bushfire expertise, and council requested additional support and funding for compliance. For legacy development, there is a gap in the planning system around legacy development. Often no asset protection zones or buffers for older residential development is there pre-PBP. And this is a similar issue for, obviously, zombie DAs and subdivisions. Council also noted the high costs associated with building bow flame zones and result in illegal clearing or building works. It was also identified as difficult to enforce bushfire-related consent conditions. For biodiversity, councils identified the importance of balancing biodiversity considerations with bushfire management. Some councils are trying to implement conservation zones to manage bushfire hazard or risk due to the absence of any other mechanism within the planning system. Managing biodiversity considerations at the planning proposal stage was identified as difficult due to conflicting advice and policies. And an increase in urban vegetation can create bushfire hazard, with new vegetation creating fire fingers, thereby increasing the vulnerability of buildings that may have been constructed to a bushfire attack level, reflective of the site pre-tree planting. So what do stakeholders want? This is loud and clear to us, how-to guidance. So to expand on existing Chapter 4 of Planning for Bushfire Protection, including how to consider climate change and when and should be an evacuation study be considered within land use planning. Knowledge sharing and collaboration and linkages between councils, strategic planning teams, bushfire management committees, the department and emergency services. Risk mapping needs to be agile and provide benchmarks for councils. Also, stronger legislated bushfire planning controls while restricting dual occupancies, maximum housing yields for special fire protection purposes or sensitive land uses. Education and training was also identified by council. Oops, missed a slide. So, Planning 101. Now watch everyone's eyes glaze over. I could talk about this all day as a planner, but anyway, I won't bore you all to tears. But I guess what we've got is a very, very complex planning system. It's multi-tiered, it's governed by legislation, policy, and public authorities. As you'd know, the planning system can be divided into two broad areas: land use planning or strategic planning, and development control. Land use planning or strategic planning is an integral component of the planning system. It sets out short-term and long-term social, environmental, economic objectives for an area and balancing all those competing interests, including delivering of housing, infrastructure, open space, public amenity, employment zones, and natural hazards, with bushfire being one of those components that we also need to consider. While most of you are familiar with the DA process through State Significant Development or Infrastructure, Section 414 of the EPA Act and 100B of the Rural Fires Act with regional and local development, we only have RFS input through the ministerial directions for planning proposals at the strategic planning stage. There is no requirement for the department or councils to engage with the RFS, nor the RFS to provide input or advice in any other strategic planning process. Through REC 27, we see this as an opportunity to integrate risk-based approach through strategic planning and have better consideration of bushfire through regional district planning, local strategic planning statements, precinct planning, and place-based strategies, so that bushfire risk is considered upfront at that planning system rather than being pushed down to that DA or post-approval. As I identified earlier, the bushfire inquiry aligns with the New South Wales flood inquiry findings in relation to moving to a risk-based approach to addressing natural hazards. So focusing on the big three, so how does bushfire compare to other hazards? There are similarities through identification through the Act, local planning directions, planning circular. There are guidelines, manuals, and there's also mapping. The key difference is there is no specific state environmental policy specifically relating to bushfire. The standard instrument for planning for bushfire only relates to hazard reduction, and risk is not being assessed in land use planning. Risk is being assessed in flood and coastal, sort of. Over to Lisa.
Okay, so why look at risk? Hazard alone doesn't create an accurate picture of how bushfire may impact communities. Hazards such as fire line intensity is only one of the factors that feeds into understanding risk. Risk allows us to take an informed and holistic approach to strategic planning. Land use planning can respond to and produce good outcomes if risk is understood. Understanding concepts such as likelihood of ignition, likelihood of impact on assets, consequence of impact such as house loss, vulnerability of assets such as houses or special fire protection purpose, and even agriculture and environment for existing and future communities are all factors that can drive the risk-based decision making. There are a number of established risk frameworks, including ISO 31000 and the National Emergency Risk Assessment Guidelines, NERAG, among others. And these existing frameworks are difficult to apply to land use planning and bushfire together. Recommendation 27 draws upon elements from these frameworks, working towards a bespoke framework to fit bushfire and land use planning for New South Wales. Risk is part of a merit-based process where evidence-based data is evaluated through an objective, quantitative and qualitative approach. Building regulation and certification play a key role for how development can occur in bushfire-prone areas, but it doesn't determine what development is appropriate where. We need to shift our consideration of risk from site-based to look at a strategic landscape to understand and consider impacts and influences beyond geographical boundaries such as local government areas. Bushfire doesn't stop at a local government area boundary, and it may have far-reaching impacts. Bushfire is one of a suite of considerations that factor into strategic planning in the planning system. Okay, we've got 3 maps here. The first map on the far side there identifies bushfire-prone land. In New South Wales, bushfire-prone land maps vegetation with the ability to carry fire in the landscape across 3 categories. Red is forest, that's category 1. Orange is grassland, that's category 3. And yellow is rainforest or small parcels of remnant vegetation, category 2. It's a hazard map. It identifies one of the factors that feed into risk. Bushfire-prone land is legislated under section 10.3 of the New South Wales EPA Act, and it's a trigger for development to consider bushfire. Leveraging off the Rural Fire Service Next Generation Operational Risk Modelling, the second map in the middle shows a first cut concept land use bushfire risk surface of present day bushfire risk using maximum fuel loads for residential houses in a worst case scenario. The Rural Fire Service is leading the development of bushfire land use risk modelling for the state. The existing operational risk mapping that we're currently doing is not necessarily fit for purpose for land use planning, as it only looks at 5 years into the future. We want to look at least 30 years into the future. The existing maps consider fire history and mitigation activities. And whilst land use planning can leverage off this for existing development, it needs to project what may happen in areas of future growth. This data is looking at areas where housing does or could occur in the future. As national parks and state forests and reserves can't be built upon in the traditional sense for housing, they're excluded from this risk data. This map uses up to 1,000 ignition points over this area with at least 18 weather scenarios running predictive fire runs multiple times before looking at likelihood, consequence and vulnerability sensitivities. And as you've probably guessed, on that map, red is the high risk and blue is your lower risk. It factors in considerations such as emergency services travelling to a location from stations, but it doesn't look at evacuation and suppression. However, the modelling is set up to be agile with the ability to incorporate latest science and plug in additional considerations. The last map in this sequence adds climate change to the mix, as recommendation 27 explicitly needs to consider and incorporate climate change. And you can see this has a subtle influence on the land use bushfire risk. One of the limitations for this map, though, is whilst it does consider climate factors, it doesn't consider things like the shift in vegetation behaviour that may come due to changing climate conditions. And I guess I just want to re-emphasise that these 2 risk maps are prototypes of what land use risk for bushfire could look like, and that the methodology is going to continue to be developed and evolve over phase 2 of the project.
So just to recap, moving to this landscape approach assists the decision makers within government to support housing and growth direct decisions based on understanding of tolerable risk, better consider what impacts climate change will have on existing and future communities when making decisions where increased population density or future population growth will occur, and to make better informed decisions and to improve decision making through informing regional and local strategic plans and be based on best available science and data. What's next? So we are working towards preparing a bushfire-prone land package, which may include a bushfire policy, statutory changes to support the bushfire policy, and updated guidance material. As Lisa identified, we are also developing a methodology for bushfire risk mapping. We will be re-establishing and broadening working groups to seek input and guidance, and there will be some form of public consultation, so you'll all be able to have a say. So, alignment with the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. Both the Department and the Rural Fire Service are working very closely with our colleagues in the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority to ensure alignment with the State Disaster Mitigation Plan. The key thing to point out is that the planning authorities and local councils must have regard to the SDMP and disaster adaptation plans when exercising its functions under the EP&A Act and Local Government Act. Last slide. Just a little project on the side. We have received funding from the Bushfire Natural Hazards Research and Technology Acceleration Program to look at how we could further inform changes to bushfire-related planning framework and any future amendments to planning for bushfire protection. We will be looking and assessing any correlation between building survival or loss relative to specific planning controls and policies. We have 11 participating councils, including Blue Mountains Council, and these were chosen on the greatest number of house loss during the 2019 bushfires. This project will be complete prior to the end of the financial year. That's it. I was going to say, if you've got any questions, the words of my 13-year-old son, be nice. Duncan?
Thanks, Lisa. And Susan, quick question. The Bushfire Risk Plan under Section 52 of the Rural Fires Act and the Bushfire Prone Land Area Map, 10.3 EP&A Act, is there some discussion about how those two mapping systems can actually talk to each other to identify risk, to better position the end user, being the mum and dad that lives in the house, to mitigate risk in terms of the development, their construction, their APZs and things like that? So one of the thoughts processes is that you increase the categories within the bushfire prone land, that those categories are directly related to the risk map, to the level of risk that's identified in the risk management planning. And then those categories are identified to different types of acceptable solutions in the planning framework for bushfire protection. So a low threat bushfire risk results in lower acceptable solutions to mitigate that risk, where you've got high stuff, high Blue Mountains ridgetop stuff, and existing PVP acceptable solutions apply.
At the moment, the bushfire prone land and the risk mapping is remaining separate. And I don't know that there are any plans at the moment in the immediate future to have a look. As we move through phase 2, it may become more apparent, but I do need to emphasise that the current risk maps that are produced are an operational tool, and bushfire prone land is only a trigger. So that doesn't mean that you assess using the bushfire prone land data. It's a trigger to identify that you need to consider any bushfire on that particular area. Make sense?
I might just add to Susan's commentary. So at the moment we do have the building, bushfire BPED. We've got the BPED tool which is running at the moment, and that is to address APZs for existing developments, looking at requirements for extension of APZs into some of these localities. In addition, I guess the plan is going forward that we will be looking at trying to match up the risk plans with what we're doing now when it comes to assessment of development.
I guess I'll just add to that the risk maps that you saw in our presentation would be added to the suite of risk mapping that's already done. So, and it would be rolled out across the state.
Hi, I'm just wondering how you take a flexible risk-based approach and put it in a standard template instrument, which at the moment doesn't allow you to prohibit certain forms of development in any area. And are you looking at a one-size-fits-all approach, or some flexibility being built into the system, into the actual planning framework?
It's still a work in progress, so I can't actually answer that. But yes, it will have to be flexible. We can't be a one-size-fits-all. We've got 120 councils that are very, very different. was going to say, have a look at the flooding, how flooding has been addressed, and that can give you an indication of what we can do within the planning system for bushfire.
Hi, Susan. Hi, Lisa. Graham Douglas. I think one of the challenges that I see is the fact that we have great difficulty even adapting to where we are. So we know that the North Coast, which is currently assessed as being an FDI 80, is already at an FDI of 100. The whole of the Central West is already 100. And we don't make efforts to actually fix up where we are today. So I guess the question really is that I think we've got a very complex system. We have 5 pathways for doing development assessment. It's not the same as strategic. But what happens is the strategic actually has to guide where the development assessment process will end up. So I think you can't do strategic in isolation from how we need to reform the rest of that process. So I just wanted to know whether you had any comments and thoughts on that sort of idea.
Baby steps, Graham. It's going to be complex. We're not going to have all the answers in one hit. It's going to progress. The goalposts will change. At this moment, the focus for the Department of Planning is the strategic, and then we can move on to site-based.
Hello, Susan. Rod O'Lone. And I'm sorry I'm going to offend your son. I'm going to ask you a hard question. So you're really lucky in that Steve Kipp gave a really good presentation on the car, the boat and the caravan. And that's about the risk appetite, okay? We drive at a speed that we feel comfortable with the risk. In your presentation and consultation, you talked about 125 people that you engaged. How do you then get that risk appetite from those people? And do you do a tell and say, this is what we're going to tell you? Or is it a sell? Or is it a consultation? Because I think that's a missing piece for me out of this process. To give you an example, if you remember the pink bats issue that we had in federal government, Peter Garrett was prepared to go up and stand and say, there is an acceptable risk of people dying in installing the pink bats in people's roofs. And at that point, Kevin Rudd realised that was not the risk appetite that his government wanted. So the question is, how do you then wash risk appetite around the whole planning process? I apologise to you, son.
Yes, he's not going to be happy with that question. Neither am I, because I can't answer it. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I'll take that question on notice. It's a tricky question, and it's a tricky area that we're focusing in on. So I don't have the answer.
But what we might say is, what was very obvious is people's understanding of risk and the different types of risk was so varied. We will need to bring people on a journey so that we're all on a common ground when we are talking about risk. So, and that is what the maps in part are hopeful to try and, what is high risk for New South Wales to be a starting point in the journey on it. But risk is an incredibly complex topic, and even just our groups, the range of what they thought risk was huge, and you are absolutely correct,
And also, I guess further to that is, as government moves this multi-hazard approach, how risk is identified between different hazards is also going to be really difficult as well, because you're comparing apples, oranges, bananas. It's a very tricky space. Thanks. It's keeping me up at night.